Our topic for the day is Indian polity. It becomes part 2, but today we are going to focus on legislature and executive. Obviously, for judiciary, we will have a separate session, and also later on as we keep going deeper and deeper. The Constitution, when it was dedicated to the country in 1950, had 22 parts. Now, they may be called parts, or sometimes informally, though, they are called as chapters. So when we say that fundamental rights is chapter 3, it could also be called part 3. And directive principles are chapter 4, which is actually part 4. In 1950, the Constitution had 22 parts. As of today, the Constitution has 25 parts. In 1950, the total number of articles in the Constitution were 395. As of today, total number of articles are 448. In 1950, the Constitution had 8 schedules. While studying Constitution, and that is something I always keep saying, we should actually always be very careful about the choice of words and should be clear about meaning of those words. When they are in the Constitution, they are called articles and schedules. They are not called section and appendix. The term section and appendix is for the laws, for the statutes. It's only for the Constitution that 1, 2, 3, 4 to 395 then and 448 now, they are called articles, not section. Never section. If you say section, it means it's some law you are talking about. And the laws are always to be made within the framework of the Constitution. Similarly, those 8, they are to be very carefully called as schedules, not appendices, the plural of appendix. They are schedules. Like Schedule 1 gives the list of all states, constituent states. They were 14 then. Now we'll have to know what, I think 29 something and number of union territories and all. Similarly, in 1950 there were 8 schedules. Now there are 12 schedules. In a way, in taking a look at this, we are also telling ourselves about the flexibility of the Constitution. That the Constitution needs to change as per time. And there is that inbuilt mechanism for the requisite changes. Then, of course, continued from yesterday's talk will be our overview of still some unitary features from our Constitution. Election Commission. Finance Commission. These are unitary features of the Constitution. Election Commission functions under powers and duties assigned under Article 324. There shall be Election Commission, there shall be Chief Election Commissioner. And the task of Election Commission is to conduct free and fair elections for Lok Sabha, for the Parliament and for assemblies. That term free and fair derives all the powers for Election Commission. Until beyond 1992-3, India had one member Election Commission. And there used to be only Chief Election Commissioner, CEC. But then, the then Chief Election Commissioner T.N. Session had continual fights with the government. So in a way, government wanted to cut him to size. We are going to study it in fuller details when we go deeper and deeper. That is how government thought of this idea of having a multi-member election commission. The constitutional validity was challenged, but Supreme Court ruling was that Article 324 says there shall be election commission and there shall be chief election commissioner. Okay? Constitution never says election commission will consist of only one member as long as there is only one chief election commissioner. So government then created the post of election commissioners. Now there are 3 members. And chief election commissioner is, as the name says, the chief one. We are going to study this change and why it was brought about because of the constitutional issues and all as we proceed. But it's one unitary feature. Then Finance Commission works under Articles 270, 273, 275 and 280. Under the Constitution, Finance Commission has to be appointed once every 5 years. So what we have now is the 14th Finance Commission, headed by an eminent officer also and an economist in his own right, N.K. Singh. And that 14th Finance Commission is yet to prepare and submit the report. So far there have been 13 Finance Commissions. The task of Finance Commission is to study financial relations between center and state and decide sharing of revenue between center and state. The Finance Commission comes up with a certain formula. I am expecting at least some of you to remember that one of the most important recommendations of the 13th Finance Commission was to increase the state's share in central revenue by 10%. Until the recommendation of the 13th Finance Commission, states' share in central revenue used to be 32%. Finance Commission recommended it to be increased to 42%. The Finance Commission was appointed by UPA government. Then elections happened and the first ever genuine non-Congress government with clear majority was voted to power by people in May 2014. But in fairness, one has to also note and state that that government, that is Modi government, did not make a political issue out of it, studied Finance Commission recommendations carefully and accepted the recommendation of increasing state share to 42%. Right from year 1, 2014, the share did increase. Because of this 10% increase, all states together got 1,32,000 crores extra, out of which Maharashtra got 11,000 crores extra. That was cooperative federalism in action. While the cooperative federalism, the term also was being used even before this government. In fact, as Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister of the country, this was Lal Krishna Advani back in 1999 who had also defined the concept on the floor of the parliament. The commitment of previous ND government also was, we believe in cooperative federalism. What it actually would mean is no party politics once the governments are in power. And if people have voted a particular government to power, there will be mutual respect. And if there is a different party ruling at the center and another party ruling at the state, there will be no politics. We will sit together, we will decide together. That is cooperative federalism. Eventually, GST also became possible because of cooperative federalism in action. That all chief ministers and their finance ministers and their chief secretaries were respectfully summoned, invited by Prime Minister. The discussion happened around round table. People were promised, and as in the latest budgets, beginning with state of Maharashtra, we have seen that the states have begun to receive their share in GST. And as I also mentioned the other day, if we carefully calculate the share, it will actually mean that by adoption of GST, total tax collection has increased, And we would do well to remember that actually tax collection has increased in a year when GDP growth rate went down. Still, tax collection increased. And because tax collection increased, the state share also further increases. It is classic case of cooperative federalism in action. So now the 14th Finance Commission is working. It decides the formula of sharing revenue between center and state. And later on we are going to follow lots of details. Planning Commission is not a constitutional body. Was. Planning Commission also was not a statutory body. Planning Commission had come into existence simply by an administrative order. But because India adopted 5-year planning based on the Soviet model, although we did not blindly follow the Soviet model also, and I am thankful for that, there was centralized planning. Therefore, Prime Minister himself was ex officio chairperson of the Planning Commission, and some eminent economist would come to be appointed as the deputy chairperson who has all executive powers, and then the Planning Commission would prepare 5-year plan. Obviously 5-year plan at all India level. So the state's plans also would be prepared within the framework of that 5-year plan, and then annual plans for both center and state would also be prepared within the framework of that 5-year plan. Over a period of time, Planning Commission emerged more powerful than Finance Commission. That also was a kind of a contradictory situation, because constitutional bodies are supposed to be more powerful. They are supposed to be more original, because they derive their existence from the constitution itself. Here was a body which was not constitutional. It was also not statutory. Statutory means a separate law was passed by the parliament, the law within the framework of the constitution. This was not even statutory. Planning Commission came into existence by virtue of an administrative order. But over a period of time, until this 12th 5-year plan was to finish in 2017, the time frame of the last, and that was 12th 5-year plan, was 2012 to 2017. And Planning Commission had become overpowering. And then come Modi Sarkar, and the government announced the policy that we are going to give up this system of 5-year plans. So no more Planning Commission. And instead of that Planning Commission, now we have Niti Aayog, National Institute for Transformation of India. It's a think tank. Again, abolition of Planning Commission and bringing into existence of Niti Aayog is both done by administrative order. No resolution in the parliament is required. Forget passage of a statute, and certainly not constitutional amendment. So now we have Niti Aayog. And I call this another piece of maturity, that Modi government did not scrap the ongoing 5-year plan halfway through. That now that we have come to power, we have the mandate, we've scrapped. That was not done. That again is an act of maturity. That if the time frame is 2017, we will let that plan continue. We will implement that plan. But from 2017 onwards, there will be no 5-year plan. You must think of a question as to, then what? If there is no 5-year plan, then what? So now the idea is, there will be perspective plans for like 15 years. Then within those 15 years, there will be perspective plan for 7 years. And each annual plan will be worked out within that framework of a 15-year perspective plan and 7-year perspective plan. If you have been careful in listening previous budgets, I'm sure you came across this term, that every once in a while, either Arun Jaitley as finance minister or some or other, that's a government policy, they would say we will fulfill this by 2022. Well, how was 2022 calculated? Is it because it is 3 years after 2019? Which means the next parliamentary election? Is it like telling the voter that we will complete it by 2022, but if you want us to keep that word, vote us to power in 2019 also? That's not how it is originally. Politics is always there, it is inevitable, And nobody should think about democratic politics as something inherently flawed, that political parties do something with their eyes on vote. The question is, what are they doing with their eyes on vote? What are they undertaking to gain votes? 2022 was because there was a 7-year perspective plan. So in 2015, because 2014 budget was not a full budget. And as finance minister also, neither Arun Jaitley nor the government found proper time to put all economic ideas into action. But the 2015 one was like full budget presented by Arun Jaitley, therefore a 7-year plan, therefore 2022. So now we have Planning Commission replaced by Niti Aayog. Our constitution displays careful borrowings from different constitutions. Like the very model for democracy is picked up straight out of UK unwritten book, the Westminster model. The parliamentary form and also the multi-party democracy with single member constituencies, territorial constituencies, single member. Please note, there is no proportional representation through single transferable vote for Lok Sabha or Vidhan Sabha elections. It's one member constituency. And people vote, and the one who gets maximum number of votes from among valid votes polled is declared elected. No minimum voting percentage for the election to be valid. No minimum voting to be secured by a candidate to be declared elected. This is called first past the post, FPTP. We picked it up all from the British model. And then the preamble, we the people, and fundamental rights are picked up from American Constitution. The idea of directive principles is also picked up from Ireland and Australia. Their constitutions have this provision. You might be surprised to know that emergency provisions are picked up from the original German constitution at that point of time. So 352, 356, 360, etc. What we did not pick up from German system then is something that is being discussed in India since 1999. That is a provision for fixed tenure of the parliament. And if we want to have fixed tenure, we also need what is called as constructive vote of no confidence. That is not there in Indian setup. And because there is no fixed tenure, our parliaments or Vidhan Sabhas can be dissolved at any time, disrupting the whole schedule, creating political instability, mind you. Like today, one subject is being spoken, again after 1999, and again for the sake of record, I must state, and you must understand, that the concept of simultaneous elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha was also presented on the floor of the parliament by Lal Krishna Advani as Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister back in 1999. But of course, Vajpayee government did not have its own majority. With the passage of time, overall position of BJP has consolidated, and then as unquestioned leader, Narendra Modi also is politically well placed to initiate the debate again, which he has done. Simultaneous elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha. For first 4 elections in independent India. First elections happened in 1952. First 4 elections until 1966-67, okay, were all simultaneous elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha. And that almost happened automatically. There was no disruption, no dissolution of any house halfway through. That disruption started in 1966-67, and since then the whole arithmetic has now disrupted And today, at any given point of time, there are always elections going on in some part of the country, this way or that way. In 1966, the Congress government at the center was a minority government for the first time. It took 20 years of post-independence development for Congress to lose its monopoly absolutely from Gully to Delhi. The 66-67 government, when after Shastriji's death, Indira ji became Prime Minister, that was a minority government which sustained with outside support from communists on one side and Muslim League on the other hand. It was an unstable government. And in the same year, when Vidhan Sabha elections happened, Congress lost in many Vidhan Sabhas, but out of those many Vidhan Sabhas, 8 states in the Hindi belt, Congress lost in all those 8. And in those states, for the first time, non-Congress governments came together. But after the Vidhan Sabha elections of 1966-67, there was a situation where no single party was anywhere close to majority of formation of government. And then Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia for the Socialist Party and Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay for Jana Sangh then, the predecessor form of BJP, came together on the political plank called as non-Congressism. Their addition in all 8 Vidhan Sabhas was just enough for them to form government. They had a slicing majority, just about 3 or 4 MLAs more. But there were Samvida Sarkar, they are known as Samvida, that is Sanyukta Vidhayak Dal. That is Socialist and Jansangh decided to come together. Their arithmetic was enough for them to be able to form governments in 8 states. They are known as Samvida Sarkar. But like I said, they had slicing majority, just about 4 or 5 in each house. What it meant is, if only 3 turned their turncoats, and the government would collapse. Governments had wafer-thin majority. And with Congress in power at the center, it wasn't really very difficult for horse trading, selling and purchases of MLAs and MPs, etc. So in a short while, all 8 governments collapsed. And they collapsed, but was Congress in a position to form government? The answer was no, Congress was not in a position. The governors of the states were then left with no choice but to dissolve the houses. And the disruption began then. And since then, for last 50 years since then, this kind of disruption has gone on. Think of also no confidence motion at the center. Sometimes the motion succeeded, sometimes it did not. The first ever non-Congress government at the center was Janata Party in March 1977. That was headed by Morarji Bhai Desai, but his government lasted 27 months. And Yashwantrao Chauhan, as leader of opposition, had moved no confidence motion. And it looked like it would be carried through. But Morarji Bhai Desai did not wait for voting to actually happen. He called on the president and tendered his resignation as Prime Minister. President Sanjeev Reddy then had lots of options in front of him. He could call anybody who, according to him, was most likely to enjoy the confidence of the House. Or he could give time limit to the Sansad, Lok Sabha, and ask Lok Sabha itself to choose their leader, who then would be invited by the president to form government. This is how governments are formed. And failing both of these options, then there is no option for the president but to dissolve the House and call for elections. Against all these choices, the then President Sanjeev Reddy chose Charan Singh to form the government. He had defected from Janata Party. We need to understand that no confidence motion against Morarji Bhai government was not put to vote. So Morarji Bhai government was not voted out of power. In fact, at the time of tendering his resignation, he was recommending dissolution to the president. At that point of time, Prime Minister's recommendation was actually binding on the president. Under constitutional principles, the Prime Minister, who has not lost the confidence of the House, then his recommendation is binding on the President. But Sanjeev Reddy, otherwise a great person himself, a freedom fighter, in his wisdom chose not to abide by that. He took a view that you are a Prime Minister who has lost majority. Actually, constitutionally speaking, he did not have that authority, because the leader of the House can only be said to have lost the confidence of the House if voting takes place. And it's only after the voting that the conclusion goes. And as long as that voting hasn't happened, President or Governor at the state cannot conclude that this leader has lost the confidence of the House. But Sanjeev Reddy concluded so and invited one of the defectors to form the government, because Indira ji had announced that she will support Charan Singh from outside. In fact, the constitutional principle also says that President is not supposed to take note of such announcements out in the public. If President is to conduct the test of who has majority, the only test is on the floor of the Parliament, and for Governor, respectively on the floor of the Assembly. But again, instead of doing that, Sanjeev Reddy invited Charan Singh, gave him some time limit. Within that time limit, it was already clear that Charan Singh cannot prove his majority. So before even that voting happened, he tendered his resignation. Then again, Morarji Bhai staked his claim, saying that I had not lost majority. So let me form the government and give me time limit to prove majority. Again, constitutionally speaking, that is what Sanjeev Reddy should have done. But this time he chose to dissolve the Parliament and go for elections. So the examples, all disruptions happen, and there is this no confidence motion. Later on, another classic case of no confidence motion is April 1999. This was NDA government, which had until then lasted 13 months. And a no confidence motion was moved by Lalu Prasad Yadav, who was leader of the opposition in Lok Sabha. The arithmetic did say that non-NDA votes seemed to be like 273. So, and there is a system of this debate. If no confidence motion is tabled, the Speaker has to take a decision whether it is accepted or not. The Speaker took a decision that, okay, let the discussion take place. Then the one who tabled the resolution has to start the debate. So there was a fiery, funny, but powerful speech by Lalu Prasad Yadav. Don't underestimate him. And especially because he is right now rotting in jail. But from political point of view, he is a very intelligent person. So he gave a fiery speech. Then as per the system, first answer has to come from the Prime Minister. And I was watching it live. So Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the consummate politician, a great leader, a great orator, charming person. When it comes to politics, again, don't underestimate him. He was, let him live for 100 years, but he's not in active politics now. As consummate politician, you can't survive there unless you are a consummate politician. So I don't mean any disrespect. He is that intelligent to understand what's happening. So when Vajpayee stood up, Prime Minister Vajpayee stood up to answer, he said, हमारी सरकार तो गिराओगे, उसकी जगह कौन सी लाओगे ये तो बताओ. Because it was very clear that there were at least half a dozen prime ministers in waiting. At least half a dozen. Because by that time Sonia Gandhi had stepped into politics. And next to BJP, Congress was the largest single party, and Congress people were like absolutely stubborn on this point, that if alternative government has to come to power, Sonia Gandhi has to become the Prime Minister. We have a permanent Prime Minister in waiting at Baramati. He had already left Congress in the same year, 1999, June 1999, and he had left Congress on the point of Sonia Gandhi's foreign citizenship. So there is no way he would, at least then, Sharad Pawar can take any political stance and convince enough number of people how it is required and how that proves that he is very intelligent, which he is. That is beyond question. Then Lalu himself and Mulayam Singh Yadav and Mayawati would not like to be left behind, and Mamta Banerjee, who is looking forward to 2019 stint. So Vajpayee knew that these people can't come together. For bringing down my government, they can come together. But what are they going to do? So if he creates this question, हमारी तो सरकार गिराओगे, उसकी जगह कौन सी लाओगे ये तो बताओ. So he knew that there would be, this is a multiple re-entry vehicle, MRV. This is a missile which while going into the space is a one missile, but as it begins to travel towards its target, from the same missile there are like 10 missiles which start off and hit 10 different targets. So when Vajpayee started his speech, the very first one, in his usual charming, still in 1999 he was also physically okay, at like his best in oratory also. So in his laughing, smiling way he stood up and he said, अच्छी बात है, आपने भाषण तो बहुत अच्छा दिया, तो हमारी सरकार गिराओगे, ये तो बताओ कौन सी लाओगे. And I'm saying again, don't underestimate Lalu Prasad. He understood what is happening, and he also understood that if he lets Vajpayee speak, okay, the no confidence motion is going to fall through. So he immediately stood up, he obstructed Vajpayee. He was sitting on the first bench, right opposite Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So immediately stood up and he said, पहले गिरने तो दो, 5 मिनट में लाएंगे दूसरी सरकार. That NDA government collapsed by a margin of 270 versus 269 votes. It was 17th of April 1999. And by a margin of 270 versus 269, the government collapsed. And like Vajpayee had predicted, nobody could come together enough to garner 273 seats in the parliament. So eventually, the president was left with no choice but to dissolve the house and go for elections. Election Commission said we are not ready for it because the elections had just happened. And an extensive revision of electoral rolls was required before next election could be conducted. President asked Election Commission what time you want. Election Commission asked for 6 months. So the elections could not happen before October. President asked Vajpayee government to continue until arrangements for alternative government are put in place. I am also bringing it to your notice that I am using words very carefully. I did not use the word caretaker government because from constitutional point of view, this term doesn't exist in our constitution. There is nothing like caretaker government. Either there is government or there is no government. From constitutional point of view, as long as there is government, the government enjoys all powers laid down in the constitution. Had there been the concept of caretaker government enshrined in the constitution, then it would mean that a government designated as caretaker has no authority to take any major policy decision. Caretaker means only day-to-day administration, only the funding sanctioned by the parliament, and you will not form any new scheme, you will not take any new undertaking, no major policy, etc. Indian constitution does not contemplate the concept of caretaker government. But this had to be done for the first time over there back in 1999. I hope you remember that that also turned out eventually to be the time for Kargil war. So long and short of the whole thing is our essential political system is drawn from UK, but Bill of Rights and preamble from US, and concept of directive principles from Australia and Ireland, emergency provisions from Germany, which is what had brought us to this point of fixed tenure and what is called as constructive vote of no confidence. Under the German constitution, their parliament known as Bundestag, Bundes means people, Stag is house, Lok Sabha. German Bundestag with 638 members has a fixed tenure of 4 years. There is not even a concept of midterm election there. The house just cannot dissolve. And if the Bundestag wants premature dissolution of the house, the German constitution needs constitutional amendment, mind you. Otherwise, it's fixed 4 years. So the discussion is on in India too that we should also have maybe fixed tenure but 5 years. Once elected, the houses will be there for 5 years. That can only happen if fixed tenure comes along with constructive vote of no confidence. Constructive vote of no confidence means anybody seeking to pass no confidence against the sitting government will have to state in the same resolution which government will replace in case the no confidence motion is carried through. Under the scheme of constructive vote of no confidence, there is not just no confidence. The same vote also has to at the same time state that we want to remove this government and replace it with this government. One line resolution, and the voting has to be for that one particularly. You can begin to see the linkages between simultaneous elections henceforth. If indeed we want simultaneous elections for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha, which I do, I am all in favor of it. And actually for simultaneous elections, we don't need any constitutional amendment. For rules of business which decide how the Parliament and Vidhan Sabha functions, there are rules of business. And there is Rule 198 for Lok Sabha functioning. For simultaneous elections to Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha, all that is required is an order under Rule 198. So in terms of the power, it is there. But I think Prime Minister is trying to generate a debate among people. Let this issue be thrashed out from all sides and let a national consensus emerge, another case of cooperative federalism. That various political parties, various states, as per whatever is their schedule, let them discuss this threadbare. Let us form a common ground, and once the national consensus emerges, then let us effect this. But it's a package of 3 points together, if we want to do it henceforth. That for simultaneous elections to Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha, we will need fixed tenure henceforth. And if there is to be fixed tenure, then we should also have the constructive vote of no confidence enshrined somewhere in the Constitution or maybe in the rules of functioning. Our ongoing point is Indian Constitution as a synthesis of various points. And we picked up consciously the task of picking and choosing. Some people like to call it hodgepodge. May they call it so. I would like to call it an intelligent synthesis and a careful choice of what is to be adopted, what is to be adapted, which features need to be changed. So I believe what we picked up is not a blind copy. We applied Indian situation to what we picked up, and the founding fathers made those decisions about having those points. On one side, I am thankful to the Constitution for describing India in the very Article 1 as not just Indian Union, but Article 1 describes India with these words, India that is Bharat. In very clear terms, it says what we are. I have a slight wish, or if I may say, with all due respect, an objection, but we will address that in another minute or so. But that objection itself notwithstanding, I am at least okay that we picked up this name for our constitutional state, the nation state. This is India that is Bharat. So the name Bharat. If I had my way, or this is something I've been speaking all the time, that given a choice of just bringing about one change in the Constitution, if I am allowed to bring one change in the Constitution, the change I would bring about is just reverse the order. Instead of calling this as India that is Bharat, I will say this is Bharat that is India. Which would also mean that at international level, official name of India also will henceforth be and have to be Bharat. This is our original name for ourselves. India is like etymologically changed pronunciation. That people in the land of 7 rivers were called Sapta Sindhavaha. And ancient Persians could not pronounce Sa, could not in the sense Sa became Ha there, so they came to be called as Hapta Hindavaha. And then because the name sounded longish, that Hapta got deleted and it's only Hindavaha. And then in ancient Greek, there is no hard H. So while the spelling may be H-I-N-D, it comes to be pronounced as Ind. And that's how the land becomes India. and the rest of the world calls us, and we choose to call ourselves as India, I don't like it. My Bharatiya mind dislikes it. Bharat is our name since Vedic times, since even before Vedic times. And that Bharat denotes cultural continuity with all diversity, one common civilization that all of us have, absolutely from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and all. So partially I am at least thankful that Bharat is there. This is our official name, even the constitutional name. But like I said, if possible, the order should be the other way around. Some of you may have begun to notice that in fact of late, I have actually begun to use the term Bharat whenever I want to talk about India and Indians, etc. But may that change come up in the constitutional scheme also. Then we have already discussed the next point, but today I thought it proper to also enlist that point. The point is about the conscious choice of democracy. And that too, a multi-party parliamentary democracy based on universal adult franchise. All of them are peaceful revolutions. But the Constituent Assembly made these conscious decisions. If we ever take a pause and ask ourselves that there are some preconditions for successful launching of democracy in a society. There are indeed. Like probably the most important precondition is society has to be cohesive, maybe largely monolithic. Like the European states, small in size, they were predominantly Christian. And then not just Christian, but they were either Protestant or Catholic. And similarly with Islam, the states were not just Islamic states, but predominantly Sunni or Shia states. From that angle, India didn't have that kind of cohesion or monochrome. We have all religions, all regions, all caste, all languages, etc., etc. But democracy needed some cohesion in social structure. India didn't have it. Democracy also, as was thought, needs well-informed voter. For a sound democracy, we need a well-informed voter, and well-informed voter almost practically presupposes well-educated voter. Now, the extent of education back in 1947 to 50 was pretty low, very low. If you just go on taking a look at these conditions, I think we will agree even today that from the point of view of prerequisites for democracy, even today someone can come up and say that we do not have that prerequisite for democracy. Think of two-party system, basically. For first past the line system to work properly, a two-party system is required. I hope you begin to see the light. If there are only two major parties and two all national parties, then the voter knows that voter has to vote for one of them, which almost automatically means that the winning candidate by default has to get more than 50% plus one votes. But we did not have two-party system then. We do not have two-party system even now. It was only fleetingly that it appeared in March 1977 that India may now get a stable two-party system. As a Karyakarta, that was also my dream. That now Congress and Janata Party, as it was called then, would be two genuine all-India parties, and there will be a stable two-party system. But even before we could hope any further, Janata Party went to dogs. And this phenomenon of Janata Party breaking into many factions had already begun from day one, from the formation of the government. But two-party system. Today, there are only two genuine all-India parties in the country. As of today, I don't think even worst of BJP haters will deny that BJP is now an all-India party. BJP truly has absolute presence, noteworthy presence from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and Kutch to literally Kohima, Nagaland. Now it would be BJP government, surprise of the surprises. Tripura, at least you can say less of a surprise, although there was a Marxist government for 25 years. So BJP and Congress are only two genuine all India political parties. Up to a point of time, various socialist parties had that potential, but they whiled away that historic opportunity also and the potential, and non-Congress socialist outfits could never develop as all India forces and possible alternatives to, say, Congress at that point of time. Similarly, communists also could be said to have been all India forces for a while. I know communists would still like to argue, which my friend argued the other day in his article in a newspaper, that we may look like we are defeated, but we are still all India force. I said, okay, keep trying your luck. But as of today, communists are left only in Kerala. Nobody knows how long. And at least even I can tell you that even communists are scared about the next election in Kerala. That they think they are going to lose even that next election. The tally that communists have right now in the parliament is lowest ever. And I don't think, at least as of today, things can happen, things can go any which way. But at least as of today, communism as an ideology and Communist Party as a political organization cannot be said to be all India party, also cannot be said to be in a position to throw a challenge at all India existence of, you can say, either Congress or BJP. So we did not have preconditions required for a stable democracy. Mind you, we had illiterate voters then, and a large section continues to be illiterate, although I think everybody understands that political wisdom and political behavior has almost nothing to do with education. In fact, given the Indian democracy, it is the poor voter who is more aware of the value of his political vote, his and her. And a middle class, higher it goes, is less politically aware and less politically active. That translates even in terms of voting percentage at different levels. My point is, even as the Constituent Assembly was aware that between 1947 to 50, the country does not have existing conditions suitable for democracy, the founding fathers still made a choice of going in for democracy, and they entrusted the responsibility of getting the country ready for genuine democracy. That responsibility was entrusted on the ruling class. There is a classic quote by Gandhiji, wherein he says that we are not ready for democracy today, but the task of rulers will be to get the country ready for democracy. If they don't do so, see Gandhiji's visionary perception. Before 1948, he said, if they don't do so, the generation born in freedom will revolt against these rulers. That's what he had said even before 1948. And we know that the first All India rebellion against the rulers happens between 1973 to 1975. It is anti-corruption crusade, which was initiated by youngsters in Gujarat, all of them born after independence. And the movement spread, and it was only after the movement spread that those youngsters thought that now it was beyond them to administer an all India movement. They wanted some leader, so they approached JP, Jayaprakash Narayan. And Jayaprakash Narayan put a condition that we will follow Gandhian path, the path of Satyagraha. We will not take law into our own hands. We will not destroy public property, and we will not be hateful towards anyone. If you accept that, I'll take up leadership. The students accepted. JP took up the leadership. The moment he took up the leadership, it became All India movement. So this was indeed the rebellion by the generation born in independence with high expectations, and those expectations were not fulfilled, so the rebellion. You will also see a major change, which I am making it a point to refer to here itself, and the change is voting behavior. For initial 3 decades, there was what is described as Tina factor. There is no alternative. That indeed for Congress there is and there was no alternative. No national alternative. This is how global democracies have developed. More you see the histories of democracy, you will see this. And then gradually various alternatives begin to come up. I hope there are at least some of you whose brain reminds them of South Africa as of now. That post-apartheid South Africa has no option except African National Congress. There is no political outfit in South Africa which can replace African National Congress. And Nelson Mandela gave a great leadership after 1990. So we have these very many leaders. Now Jacob Zuma gets removed, but there is no alternative there. No alternative in terms of party. I know some of the efforts are on, but in democratic evolution it takes time. So in India too, it has taken a time, a long time. But alternatives have emerged, and I believe Indian democracy has become stronger and stronger. What I'm saying is, Tina factor, there is no alternative, okay? Tina factor was replaced with this scary factor called as anti-incumbency factor. That for first 3 or 4 decades, it was advantageous for the sitting government to go to elections. It was politically advantageous to face elections when you are sitting in power. Now I know, I'm not saying I'm sure, I'm telling you I know that all governments are scared to confront elections because they know that the voter has awakened, that democracy in India is strengthened, and voters' expectations are really sky high. How sky high? Rajiv Gandhi, who had 415 seats in a house of 523, still said that people's expectations are scary. And I agreed with him then, as I agree now, that in fact sitting governments are now scared to face elections because there is anti-incumbency factor. That in Tamil Nadu, in every next election, the voter would remove sitting government because they would be dissatisfied. So it's a game between DMK and AIDMK, and it remains to be seen about what happens to Kamal Hassan, his political outfit, unpronounceable political outfit, and whatever Rajnikant does. Rajasthan, every time people have flipped. So BJP in Rajasthan is worried as of now because the assembly election is coming up, and in every next election, Rajasthani voter has changed the sides. Sides in the sense changed the government. The voter has understood his power. Democracy in India has strengthened across last number of years. Constitution also has strengthened. With that optimism, we will continue our study tomorrow also, but offer our prayer for the day.